Dan was hired by a mysterious contractor to clean an abandoned building, but he never expected to find a room full of snakes when entering one of the rooms. He did not like snakes at all, but something else was at play here. The snakes were very aggressive. Dan had never seen this before. Then he saw something underneath the snakes. He realized they were protecting something. Dan got a strange feeling about this. He was totally baffled. This couldn't be good. Dan tried to come closer to the object, but with every step, the snakes became more aware of Dan. Dan had to be careful, but when trying to reach for the object, he was bitten. He felt intense pain in his arm. He couldn't do this alone. He went back to his van, which was parked right in front of the house. He applied a bandage first, but he still had a lot of pain in his arm. He thought about leaving this alone, but was offered a lot of money to do the job. Then he got a call. Dan was suddenly called by an anonymous number. He picked up. Dan got told that he needed to hurry up or bad things would happen. Dan looked around. It was like the person was watching him. What was the meaning of this? Dan got threatened by this person. He was told that if he did not deliver the object that same day, bad things would happen to him and his family. Dan was completely shocked. This could not end well for him. Dan mustered all of his courage to call the police, but when they answered, he hung up. He could not risk the safety of his family. It was way too risky. He just needed to clean this room and give this contractor whatever he wanted. He decided he would go back to the room to do what was asked of him. He decided not to call anyone to help him just because he did not know who hired him in the first place. He had to get good protective gear. However, the bite on his arm also started to hurt a lot. This couldn't be good. Dan quickly picked up his gear and drove back to the house. The whole time he had a feeling he was being watched, but he did not see anyone. Dan knew deep down that he needed medical attention, but he decided to get the object out of the room first. Dan reluctantly walked back into the house. He walked up the massive staircase. He already heard the hissing of the snakes. The strange thing was, there were no snakes outside of the room. They were all inside the room. When entering the room again, his jaw dropped. He walked in and gasped. It looked like the room was filled with even more snakes now. They instantly turned to Dan. They were very aware of Dan's presence, but did not straight up attack him. Only when Dan got closer, they reacted. Dan was in total shock. He wondered how he got into this situation in the first place. He should never have accepted the job. He was just hired to clean out the abandoned building. He did not foresee any snakes. He knew he just had to go through with it. This will all be over soon. Dan had worked difficult jobs before, but never liked this. There was extra pressure on him. Dan quickly tried to make his way through the snakes. His protective suits seemed to help him a lot. But then he felt something holding him back. It was not a feeling that was holding Dan back, but the snakes started constricting his movement. Sweat broke out, and Dan did not know what to do. He wanted to give up, but he was so close. The snakes started crawling all around his feet, and Dan tripped. This could be the end. Dan felt extremely constricted. The snakes kept circling him. They started biting his suit as well. Dan felt like this could not go well for a long time. He crawled back up and with all his strength moved towards the object. Then he started feeling a lot of pain. He felt pain throughout his entire body. The snakes had managed to penetrate the suit on his right leg. He tried kicking them off, but one managed to bite him. Dan started feeling sick. He then felt something else around his neck. Dan fell to the ground and started gasping for air. He had never felt like this before. It was as if he was strangled by the snakes. Dan kept gasping for air, and he tried throwing the snake off of him at the same time. It had completely circled around Dan's neck. The snake kept putting pressure on me. Dan crawled, and by some miracle, the snake let loose. Dan did not know if it was because he poked it a couple of times in the eyes, or if there was something else. He thought he heard footsteps as well, but it could be the lack of oxygen. However, Dan wasn't wrong. Due to the snake venom and the lack of oxygen, Dan felt extremely unwell. He had managed to drag himself to the hallway, but he realized he had no strength to get up anymore. He didn't tell anyone where he was, but he still heard voices. Was this in his head? Dan couldn't take it anymore. He went in and out of consciousness. After a while, he completely blacked out. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was downstairs. How did this happen? All around him, he saw people. Dan had no idea what was going on, but then people did not seem friendly at all. He overheard a conversation between two men. They talked about what they should do with Dan. He knows too much. Eventually, Dan gets dragged away. He realizes he is not safe at all. These people do not have good intentions. He was loaded into a white van and they drove him away. Dan tried shouting, but nothing came out of his mouth. He was too scared. Dan still has no idea what is going on. There is a man in a black hoodie next to him. He realizes Dan is awake. He instantly alerts the driver. Another man then got into the back. They did not hesitate. Without asking if he was okay, they started asking questions. Dan recognized one of the voices. It was the man that had called him this morning. The man asked if he had gotten hold of the item in the room. Dan was so weak that he just shook his head. They weren't satisfied with his answer. But then Dan blacked out again. Dan woke up again. He was hooked up to a monitor, and when looking around, he realized he was all alone in a creepy room. Dan had no clue what was going on. When he tried getting up, he realized that he was strapped to the bed. Then someone entered the room. A man that looked like a doctor entered the room. He had stitched up Dan and provided him with the necessary care. The man looked extremely nervous. Dan asked him to let him go, but the doctor remained silent. Then he nodded to a camera. Two men came into the dark room and unstrapped Dan. Dan was dragged into another room. This looked more like an interrogation room. Dan begged the people to let him go, but they wouldn't budge. They started asking him questions. Dan was asked if he knew what they were looking for. Dan had no idea, but he had a feeling that it had something to do with the house and the snakes. They needed something very special or sensitive in that room to get a hold of. Apparently, they wanted someone else to do it without risking anyone. They asked if he had been involved or informed anyone about what he was doing there. Dan assured them he did not tell anyone about his job, not even his wife. He was scared. The man started to believe him, but then they heard a loud bang. Dan is extremely confused. The man got up and quickly ran away. Dan did not know what to do and remained seated. He heard a lot of shouting and gunfire. This cannot be good. Then he saw something rolling in the room and he was blinded. Dan heard shouting all around him while he was on the floor. He covered his ears because some of the noises really pierced through. Dan got grabbed by someone who told him to stay low. Then Dan realized what was happening. A SWAT team had broken into the building. They were just in time to break Dan out of this strange situation. Dan had so many questions in his mind. How did they even get here? Were they looking for him? They would all be answered soon. Dan was brought outside, and in the corner of his eye, he saw the two men who had been questioning him earlier. They were both arrested. Dan was relieved, but he still had a lot of questions. He felt low on energy as well. But he had to tell them about the house. First, the team told Dan they weren't there for him. It was blind luck that he was rescued. Dan was just lucky enough that the SWAT team got enough information to arrest this criminal organization that Dan was being kept at. Then he started telling them about the snakes. The men that rescued Dan were completely confused about Dan's story. They never had heard of something so absurd, however. Dan had the bite marks to prove he was telling the truth. So they followed him to the house. Dan decided to guide them to the house. It took a while for them to get there. When they arrived, they saw something that stunned them. Dan's car was completely burned out. The criminals had set fire to his truck. Then they decided to enter the house. When they entered, everyone was stunned. They indeed heard loud sneak noises. Some of the men accompanying Dan were terrified of snakes. They told Dan they wanted to wait for a special team before going into the room. Dan almost couldn't wait anymore. Dan did not want to go in all by himself. Who could blame him? He almost died when going in there. Dan knew someone at the police who could quickly get a team together. He called the police headquarters, and within minutes, they arrived. The team quickly arrived in protective suits. Dan was relieved he finally felt safer with all these people around him. He had heard that the police had picked up his wife and children as well to keep them safe. The criminals were almost all caught, but it would be too risky to assume they wouldn't retaliate. Dan gives them some instructions on where the room is located. Dan is also an expert, so they carefully listen to him. The team is extremely motivated to make sure this mystery is solved. This is finally the time. The police team is going in while the entire area is secured. They make sure that no one can enter the premise. Then the team goes in, and Dan could follow all the movement via the radio. He was allowed to listen in with the captain. He hears that the team is slowly clearing the snakes. It seems to go better than Dan did. However, they asked for some more people as backup, who instantly came in. The snakes were very aggressive. They did not want to let go of the object. Dan then hears a lot of noises, some screams and a lot of loud snake hissing. It seems the team has a lot more trouble than they had foreseen. They proposed to just burn the entire building down. But now, higher-ups wanted to know as well what they were protecting. More police forces arrive, as well as Homeland Security and some government agencies. Dan was told by the police captain to go home. He assured Dan he would get a call tomorrow with what they had encountered. The next day, the police captain did not call, but Dan was surprised who actually called. When the phone rang, Dan never expected this. On the other side of the phone was the major, who had some crucial information for him. Dan was asked to come into the major's office. Dan did not know if this was a good thing or something terrible. He still had the object on his mind. He needs to know what it is. It would soon be revealed by the major. When entering the office, Dan was told to sit down. He had brought his wife and kids with him. First, the major assured him that the whole organization was arrested. He would not have to fear them anymore. Then, someone else joined the room. The police captain joined the room. He had a medal with him to honor Dan's bravery. The captain had told everything to the major. The major was so intrigued by the story that he had to give Dan this medal. He also decided to share classified information. They began telling Dan that they had managed to clear out the room that night. It had taken them 5 hours to clear the entire room. When they realized why the snakes were there and why there were so many, it finally clicked for them. The snakes were protecting their own eggs. These are extremely expensive and fragile. That is why the criminals needed a specialist who had no clue what was going on to retrieve them for them. Dan sighed. He was happy it was all over.